The sound that followed was not the clean pop of a healthy extraction. It was a low, wet crack, and with it, a fragment of jawbone the color of old parchment came away in the dentist's forceps. The woman in the chair was 24 years old. Her name was Molly Maggia. She had once painted watch dials for a living. The bone crumbled like dry plaster. Her death certificate would list ulcerative stomatitis and anemia. The dentist, seeing the honeycombed decay, called it phosphorus necrosis. He was wrong. There was no phosphorus in the luminous paint she had touched to her lips 1,000 times a day. There was radium, and radium does something the body never evolved to recognize. It wears calcium's uniform. The skeleton mistakes it for a nutrient, weaves it into the mineral lattice, and locks it there for 1,600 years. Inside the bone, each alpha particle shreds the marrow, silences the blood factories, turns the jaw into a fragile shell. The girls who painted those dials did not know. They were told the paint was harmless. They painted their teeth and fingernails before evening dances. They walked home glowing, their hair, their smiles, their hands throwing back a faint blue light that neighbors stopped to admire. The company's own chemists wore lead aprons and handled radium with long tongs. The company locked a lethal Harvard report in a lead-lined safe. The girls were given cotton smocks and a lie. This is the deep archive. Leave the surface. The hatch seals. Below the dance halls and the patent tonics, there are sealed rooms we are only now entering. A camel hair brush dried with radium. A fluoroscope switched off in total darkness, revealing a skeleton lit from within. A suppressed memo typed in triplicate, the carbon still legible. A Geiger counter clicking over a grave where the grass has grown for a century. The evidence is not lost. It was buried deliberately. Open the file. The descent begins now. It was past midnight, and the dark in the laboratory on Rue Lomond was not an absence of light, but a kind of pressure, a cold, wet weight that settled on glassware and iron clamps. The Curies had left a small dish on the bench, a porcelain crucible no larger than a child's palm, in which a few grains of a barium-radium chloride residue rested after months of fractional crystallization. Marie had noticed before that the dish gave off a faint luminance, but tonight, in the windowless room after the last gas lamp had been doused, the light was unmistakable. A steady, ice-blue glow rose from the salt, strong enough to cast the shadow of a chemical stand onto the wall. It seemed not to illuminate objects so much as to inhabit them, a cold phosphorescence that appeared to come from nowhere or from everywhere inside the crystals. Pierre stood beside her in silence, his hand on the back of a chair. On the open notebook page beneath the dish, the tiny handwriting of equations and measured weights was washed in that same spectral color, as if the numbers themselves had begun to emit light. The thing in the dish was warm to the touch, a warmth that never diminished, and no one in the world could yet explain why. The element had been isolated just a few months earlier, in December of 1898, from 1 metric ton of pitchblende residue shipped from the Joachimsthal mines in Bohemia. Marie had processed the ore in cauldrons that stained her fingers and burned her throat, stirring boiling basins with an iron rod in a drafty shed that was once a dissecting room. The yield from that first ton was roughly 1/10 of a gram, a pinch of white powder that possessed two properties no other known substance shared. First, it glowed without any apparent chemical reaction, without flame or friction, a perpetual luminescence that violated the everyday physics of combustion. Second, It produced heat continuously, enough to keep a small quantity of water permanently above the temperature of the surrounding air. In the vocabulary of late 19th century science, this was a quiet scandal. The law of conservation of energy declared that energy cannot be created from nothing, but radium, sitting harmlessly on a watch glass, seemed to be doing precisely that. It was an impossibility that weighed less than a postage stamp and refused to conform. The initial scientific response was wonder, dressed in careful language. Papers read before the Académie des Sciences described the element as a curiosity, a marvel, a new class of luminous substance. But the learned words barely contained a deeper excitement. Radium appeared to possess an internal reservoir of energy that could, in principle, sustain itself for periods far exceeding a human lifespan. Marie herself, working with Pierre, measured a half-life of 1,600 years, a number so vast compared to the tempo of human affairs that it effectively meant forever to anyone holding the glass vial. That foreverness was the first seed of the trouble. A thing that burns without fuel, that gives heat without ash, that shines without consumption, invites a very specific kind of misreading. When the object is invisible to the eye, but makes its presence known through warmth and light, it is easy to mistake it for a source of life, rather than a source of continuous subatomic violence. The leap from laboratory to pharmacy was not a cynical conspiracy, at least not at the outset. It was a leap of metaphor. The logic ran like this. If radium could pour out energy indefinitely, then perhaps it could pour energy into a human body. If it could warm water, perhaps it could warm the sluggish blood of an anemic patient. If it gave off light, perhaps it could illuminate the darkened organs of a consumptive. This was not witchcraft. It was the applied optimism of an age that had just seen electricity turn night into day and telegraphy compress the Atlantic into a second. The notion that a pinch of powder could restore vigor to aging tissue seemed less supernatural than merely technical, a problem of dosage and delivery. And so, within a decade of its discovery, radium left the crucible and entered the patent medicine bottle. The tonics appeared under names that sounded at once scientific and comforting: Radithor, Arium, Radol. They were sold in glass vials that a gentleman could tuck into his waistcoat pocket next to his watch. The advertising copy was as luminous as the product. Perpetual sunshine promised one brochure for radium-infused bathing salts, and the phrase was not entirely empty. The salts really did glow, faintly, when dissolved in warm bath water, turning a tub into a private grotto of pale light. Radium-laced chocolate was available in boxed assortments. The cream centers tinged with a substance supposed to revitalize the glands. Spas in Germany and Czechoslovakia offered radium inhalation rooms where guests sat in wicker chairs breathing the emanations of radon gas, a daughter product of radium's decay, while attendants took their pulses and noted improvements in complexion. A popular American line of cosmetics included a radium face cream marketed to women for a healthy, lasting glow. The word glow did a great deal of work. It connected the visual fact of the blue light to the metaphorical radiance of health, and it did so without ever mentioning that the mechanism by which radium produced its light had very little in common with the mechanisms of cellular repair. To be fair, the medical establishment was not uniformly credulous. Some physicians raised concerns early on about the lack of any controlled trials, about the absence of evidence that radium passed harmlessly through the body. But those concerns were muffled by the sheer volume of anecdotal success and by the profound human desire for a cure that works by proximity. The paradox of radium therapy was that its harm could mimic its benefit. Small doses occasionally produced a sense of warmth, a slight increase in metabolic rate, a temporary flush of the skin, artifacts of cellular irritation that could be interpreted as rejuvenation. The element stimulated because it damaged, and the damage, before it accumulated, felt like life. That early confusion between stimulus and destruction would replay itself across decades of occupational disease. But in the years before the First World War, it was still barely visible, a crack in the porcelain no one was looking for. There is a photograph of a radium pharmaceutical laboratory from 1910. The room is clean, tiled, and orderly. Technicians in white coats measure powders onto brass scales, the blades of the scales catching a little of the blue light from the open containers. The air must have smelled of ozone and something faintly metallic. No one wears a mask. No one seems in a hurry. The image is, in its own way, a document of innocence, an innocence that was not stupidity, but the honest ignorance of a profession that had not yet learned to fear what it could not see. The chemists at these firms handled radium with their bare fingers, occasionally licking a brush to shape a label, and they went home with dust on their collars and a faint, persistent radiance on their hands that their spouses sometimes remarked upon at dinner. The archive does not record whether any of them worried. The archive records instead the mounting orders from hospitals, clinics, and private consumers, the invoices stamped PAI, the ledgers that would, in time, become a different kind of record. The curious thing about radium, the thing that made it so easy to sell and so difficult to regulate, was that its danger was invisible to every available instrument except the most specialized. It did not burn the tongue like acid. It did not cause vomiting within hours like arsenic. It settled into the body without announcement, accepted by the bone's architecture as if it were calcium, and there it began its quiet work on a timescale that human intuition cannot easily perceive. The warm dish in Pierre Curie's laboratory carried, within its microscopic structure, the potential to irradiate living tissue for centuries. But in 1903, when the Curies shared the Nobel Prize with Henri Becquerel, no one yet knew that the same properties that made the element valuable to physics would make it catastrophic to biology. The glowing powder was still a miracle in search of a purpose beyond the tonic. And it found one. The precision instrument industry in the early 20th century was facing a commercial problem. Wristwatches for soldiers, aviators, and automobile drivers needed to be legible in the dark. The solution was a luminous paint that could be applied to the numerals and hands of a watch dial, allowing them to glow for hours after exposure to light. Radium, combined with a zinc sulfide phosphor, produced a steady, self-luminous compound that needed no external recharge. The technical requirements of application were exacting. The line had to be fine, the numerals crisp, the crescent tips of the hands sharp as a draftsman's ink. And, as any foreman in the dial painting trade would explain, the finest work could only be done with the smallest brushes, pointed repeatedly between the lips of a trained worker to maintain a needle tip. The factory that would perfect this technique was already under construction in Orange, New Jersey. The women who would work there had not yet been born or were children playing in tenement courtyards, unaware that a future job awaited them that would pay more than any other factory work available to girls their age, and that the bonus came in the form of a substance they would be taught to admire, to wear, and to swallow. The laboratory on Rue Lomond is long gone, but the blue glow has never been extinguished. Some of the radium isolated that first year still sits in sealed ampoules in European museums, and it emits today the same cold light Marie Curie watched that December night, identical in wavelength, identical in intensity, identical in its indifference to the century that has passed around it. If you were to stand in the dark with one of those museum ampules long enough, your eyes would adjust, and you would begin to read the labels on nearby shelves by its light. The notebook page would still be legible. The equations would still add up. The only thing the glow cannot tell you, and never will, is what it costs to keep it burning. That particular ledger is kept elsewhere, in the bones of the women who would soon bring it to their lips, not as a tonic, but as a daily, delicate, and irreversible craft. The morning light came through the tall windows in Orange, New Jersey, and fell in wide, pale sheets across the long wooden tables. The room was not large by industrial standards, no clattering looms, no hissing steam, but it held a particular kind of quiet, the quiet of concentrated young women seated shoulder to shoulder, bent over small trays of luminous paint. The air smelled of camphor and zinc sulfide and something else, something with no odor at all. The girls called it the paint room, though the company's ledgers named it the dial painting department. The walls were painted a pale institutional green, a color chosen for calm, and the windows were kept open in summer because the work required steady hands, and steady hands do not thrive in stifling heat. Each station was arranged with monastic simplicity: a shallow glass dish filled with a thick cream-colored paste, a set of fine camel hair brushes, a small bottle of distilled water, and a metal rack holding dozens of brass watch dials stamped with the names of manufacturers who had contracted with the United States Radium Corporation. The dials arrived blank and emerged luminous, their numerals and minute tracks glowing a soft, ghostly green-blue when the lights went out. Between arrival and departure lay the gesture that made everything possible, a gesture so small and so repetitive that after the first hour it became automatic, an act the body performed without the mind's supervision. The brush was no thicker than a pencil lead at its tip. To lay a clean line of paint along the narrow channel of a numeral required a point so fine that a single stray hair would ruin the work. The girls learned the technique on their first day, watching a senior painter demonstrate it with practiced ease. Dip the brush into the radium paste, lift it, then bring it smoothly to the lips. With a single, subtle motion, the tip was wetted by the tongue and rolled to a perfect needlepoint. Then the brush went back to the dial, and the line was drawn, and the cycle began again. Lip, dip, paint. Lip, dip, paint. The rhythm of a dozen young women working in unison produced a soft, wet sound that played beneath the silence of the room like a metronome. It was not unpleasant. Some of the girls hummed popular tunes between dips, dance hall melodies that drifted across the tables and died against the green walls. The work was clean, well paid, and safe. The company assured them of this repeatedly, and the company's chemists were men of standing who wore neckties and spoke in quiet, authoritative tones. The paint contained radium, a newly discovered element that glowed by its own internal energy, an element so rare and so expensive that a single gram cost the equivalent of a working man's annual salary. If it were dangerous, the reasoning went, the company would not hand it to teenage girls in open dishes. And the pay was extraordinary. A skilled dial painter could earn 3, sometimes 4 times the average wage of a factory worker. For young women who had grown up in immigrant households where every penny was spoken for before it arrived, the job was more than employment. It was status. It meant new shoes, money for the cinema, a chance to help a younger brother through school. To be a dial painter was to be chosen, The company selected its workers carefully, preferring girls between 14 and 18 whose hands were small and whose fingers were steady. The same physical traits that made them adept at needlework and handwriting made them ideal for placing luminous paint into the narrow channels of a watch dial. Theirs was an artisan's skill, a craft that combined the precision of a jeweler with the manual discipline of a scribe, and they were proud of it. The strange part was not that the work was difficult. The strange part was that the method of achieving perfection was so intimate that it dissolved the boundary between the worker and the worked material. Each time a brush passed between a girl's lips, a tiny quantity of radium paint entered her mouth. Not much, a fraction of a milligram at a time, but repeated hundreds of times per day, thousands of times per week. The arithmetic of ingestion became a second ledger, kept not on paper but in the soft tissues of the cheeks, the gums, the throat, and eventually, the bone. The brush tip carried the paint, and the paint carried radium-226, and the radium-226 carried a rate of decay that would outlast not only the painter, but the building, the street, and the city that contained them. At lunchtime, the girls would brush the dust from their skirts and step outside into the sun, and the powder that had settled on their hair and collars would become invisible again. But in the dark, the same powder turned their clothing into a faint constellation, a field of tiny green-blue points that clung to wool and cotton and skin. They laughed about it. They would cup their hands over their mouths in the coat room with the lights off and watch the outline of their own lips shimmer in the darkness, the residue of 100 perfect points. The walk home after the late shift became a procession of luminous figures moving down Main Street, their hair glowing at the temples, their fingernails and teeth catching the low light of the street lamps and throwing it back in a color nature had never intended. The company's management did not discourage this. It was good for morale, and the sight of glowing girls walking home through the evening streets was, in its own way, free advertising. Passers-by would stop and stare. Radium was a miracle substance, a modern wonder that promised a future of clean, infinite energy. If a little of it dusted the skin of the young women who handled it, that was merely a harmless curiosity, a charming side effect of a respectable trade. What none of them could see, not the girls, not the floor supervisors, not the men who signed the paychecks, was the biological mimicry that radium was already performing inside their bodies. Radium sits directly beneath calcium on the periodic table, a placement that is not merely chemical trivia, but a sentence written in the language of atomic structure. The body uses calcium to build and repair bone, and the body's molecular machinery cannot reliably distinguish between calcium and radium. It accepts both. It threads radium into the hydroxyapatite crystals of the skeleton, as though it were the correct material, as though a foreign agent had presented perfect credentials at the door of every cell. So with each lip-pointed stroke, each fleck of swallowed pigment, a small deposit was made into an account from which there could be no withdrawal. The radium entered the bloodstream, migrated to the bones, and settled there with the patience of an element that has no biological clock to measure. The girls walked home glowing, and the glow was the visible fraction of a process that was already, silently, restructuring the architecture of their skeletons into something that would one day be studied in laboratories and buried in lead-lined caskets. The factory continued to expand. At its peak, the dial painting department employed over 100 young women, and the demand for luminous watches, aircraft instruments, and military gauges showed no sign of slowing. The United States Radium Corporation shipped dials to manufacturers across the country, and the girls of Orange, New Jersey became known for producing the finest luminous surfaces in the industry. A watch with a proper radium dial could be read in total darkness, a quality that mattered to soldiers in trenches and pilots in night flights, and the precision required to achieve this effect was entirely dependent on the lip-pointing technique. Mechanical alternatives were tried and abandoned. No machine could achieve the delicate taper of a brush shaped by human lips. The door to the paint room was not locked. The windows were not sealed. The work was not hidden. It was simply that the language to describe what was happening did not yet exist. The term radium jaw had not been coined. The concept of internal radiation dosimetry was decades away. The only vocabulary available belonged to the company's assurances and the girls' own experience, which was that they were well paid, respected for their skill, and surrounded by a substance that turned their ordinary bodies into sources of light. In the archive of industrial history, the dial painting room occupies a peculiar position. It was a place of genuine craft and genuine pride, and it was simultaneously a delivery mechanism for a poison that masqueraded as a building material. The same careful hands that produced flawless watch dials were, stroke by stroke, laying down a pattern of damage that would take years to become readable. The intimacy required by the work was not a perversion of the job. It was the job, and the job paid well. At 5 o'clock, the girls would cap their paint dishes, set their brushes in water, and stand up from the long tables with the slight stiffness that comes from hours of focused stillness. They would smooth their skirts and check their hair in the reflection of the dark window, and they would walk out into the evening air, carrying on their skin the evidence of their labor. The sun would set behind the factory, and as the light drained from the sky, a second light, faint, diffuse, and entirely unnatural, would begin to rise from their teeth, their nails, the corners of their eyes. They were walking archives of an element that had no business being inside a human body, and they glowed, and they did not know. The factory whistle would sound, and the night shift would take its place at the tables, and the rhythmic, wet sound of a dozen brush tips passing between lips would resume, soft as a whispered secret, steady as a clock that is counting down to something it cannot yet name. The evening began with a mirror. Not the silvered glass kind that hung in the boarding house hallways, but a pocket mirror no larger than a lady's compact, tilted toward the gaslight as a girl leaned close and opened her mouth. She held a fine camel hair brush between her fingers, the same brush she had used all day to trace numerals onto the faces of military wristwatches. Now she dipped it into a tiny pot of pale greenish paste and painted the enamel of her front teeth with a single, careful stroke. When she closed her lips and reopened them in the dim room, her smile had become a thin crescent of cold blue light. Her two roommates did the same, taking turns with the brush, painting their fingernails, their earlobes, even a line across each eyebrow. They laughed at the effect. The paint dried quickly, invisible in ordinary lamplight, but ready to ignite in the dark. By the time they stepped onto the street, their hair carried a faint dusting of radium powder that had settled from the factory air, invisible in the dusk, but already beginning its slow, silent work. They were 17 and 18 years old, earning more money in a week than their fathers made in a month, and they glowed. This was 1920, the hinge between a war and a decade that would roar. The United States Radium Corporation in Orange, New Jersey, was shipping luminous watch dials by the gross to the military and to a civilian market newly obsessed with gadgets, speed, and visibility in the dark. The young women who painted those dials had become known around town as the Ghost Girls or the Shining Girls, and they wore the nickname with pride. Their shift ended at 5:30. By 6, they were walking arm in arm toward the dance halls on Main Street, their blouses still flecked with luminous dust, their skin carrying an accidental afterglow that made them the most recognizable young women in the county. The strange part was not that they glowed. The strange part was that nobody, not the foreman, not the company chemists, not the town doctors, told them that what they were doing to their own bodies was anything other than a harmless marvel. The paint was called Undark, a name that promised clarity, safety, modernity. The girls used it to make themselves beautiful in the dark, and the dark, for a little while, agreed. When they arrived at the dance hall, the ultraviolet lights that the management had recently installed to showcase the new fluorescent fashions would catch the painted smiles first. A girl would step onto the floor, and her mouth would become a floating ribbon of blue, suspended in the low light. Then her hands would appear, the nails glowing like 10 small moons. And if she had been especially playful that afternoon, her eyebrows might add an arch of phosphorescence that gave her face a look of delighted surprise. The other dancers, the ones who worked in the hat factories or the telephone exchange, would pause and stare. Some asked where they could buy the same paint. Others simply envied the effect, the way a shining girl seemed to carry her own private electricity, a kind of celebrity borrowed from the future. The jazz band played. The clarinet climbed a slow arpeggio, and the rhythm section kept a steady, sleepy pulse beneath. The girls danced, and as they moved, the radium light on their teeth and skin seemed to pulse with the music, though that was only the illusion of movement. In truth, the light was constant, each tiny crystal of radium salt bombarding the zinc sulfide in the paint with alpha particles, and the zinc sulfide converting those invisible collisions into visible photons, a steady fluorescence that required no external source, no charge from the sun, no filament, no wire. The light was atomic, self-contained, indifferent. A girl wearing Undark on her teeth had a small piece of the periodic table's most violent corner smiling out at the world. And the world smiled back. To understand why they did it, you have to place yourself in a moment when radium was not yet a poison in the public mind. It was the wonder element, discovered by the Curies in 1898, and still, 2 decades later, radiating an aura of almost supernatural promise. Newspapers called it liquid sunshine. Health spas offered radium-infused steam baths. There were radium creams for the complexion, radium drinking water, even a popular tonic called Radithor that promised to cure everything from fatigue to arthritis by delivering a gentle, internal warmth. The dial painters in orange had no reason to suspect that the luminous dust they carried home was anything other than one more modern luxury, a perk of the job, a tiny magic trick they could perform on their own bodies each night. And so they performed it with pleasure. The painted smile became a signature. On the walk home after a dance, the girls could see one another in the dark without streetlights. The luminescence was faint, nothing like the photographs that would later be staged for newspaper exposés, but it was unmistakable. A group of 3 or 4 young women walking down a residential street at 10 o'clock at night, their hair seeming to emit a soft halo from the dust that had accumulated during the day, their hands leaving brief, ghostly trails as they gestured in conversation, their teeth occasionally flashing when they laughed. Neighbors who looked out their windows saw what appeared to be a slow procession of light, a quiet parade of the almost living, beautiful, and unsettling in equal measure. The girls knew they were being watched. That was part of the pleasure. In a town where most young women faced a future of textile mills or domestic service, the dial painters enjoyed a kind of minor aristocracy. They dressed well. They bought silk stockings. They got engaged at higher rates than their peers. The glow was a mark of belonging to a select group, the ones who had steady hands and small fingers, and the good fortune to work with the most glamorous substance of the age. When one of them announced at a party that she worked at the Radium plant, she did not say it was shame. She said it the way a film actress might name her studio, with a practiced offhandedness that implied the glamour was so familiar as to be unremarkable. The record is clear on this point. The glowing was not a secret ritual. It was a public performance, encouraged by the company. Foremen sometimes gave the girls extra paint to take home for the purpose. The factory's own promotional materials showed smiling women with luminous watches, surrounded by an air of cheerful modernity. The fact that the chemists who handled the raw radium wore lead aprons and worked behind glass shields was not shared with the girls on the painting floor. That fact lived in a different room, inside a different ledger, behind a door that would not open for another 5 years. And so, the music played. A saxophone solo climbed and fell. The ultraviolet lamps hummed above the dance floor. A girl named Grace, who would later spend years learning the word mesothorium so she could pronounce it correctly in a courtroom, adjusted the strap of her dress and laughed at something her friend said. Her teeth glowed. Her friend's fingernails glowed. The dance floor was a constellation of small, borrowed lights. The band took a break, and the girls sat at a linen-covered table and drank cold lemonade, and the condensation on the glasses reflected the blue points of their painted nails. When they left the hall near midnight, the street was quiet and the air had cooled. The walk home was less than a mile, past the low brick buildings of the factory district, and then into the narrow streets of the workers' neighborhood. On that walk, the radium dust that clung to their clothes and hair, the dust they could never entirely brush off, the dust that sifted into the fabric of their coats and the creases of their shoes, began to speak in its own mute language. Because radium-226 decays slowly, emitting an alpha particle and transforming into radon gas. That gas, invisible and chemically inert, would rise from their hair as they walked, a faint, imperceptible exhalation of radioactive progeny. The girls breathed it in. They swallowed it. The dust settled into their lungs and migrated, particle by particle, toward the bloodstream, toward the bone marrow, toward the places where the body would mistake it for calcium and begin the long, meticulous process of building it into the skeleton. None of this was felt. None of it was visible. The walk home felt like a walk home, the pleasant fatigue of dancing still in their legs, the sound of their heels on the pavement, the occasional flash of a painted tooth when one of them turned to say goodnight at a corner. They were not ghostly because they were dying. They were ghostly because the element that made them shine had begun its quiet rearrangement of their insides, and the light they wore so casually was the only outward sign of a chemistry that would take years to complete its work. The paradoxical thing, and paradox is the wrong word because it implies a contradiction where there is only a sequence. The unbearable thing is that their beauty in the dark was real, not a trick, not a delusion. The luminescence was genuine. a physical phenomenon produced by the most energetic interactions then known to science. The girls were, in the most literal sense, radiant, and that radiance was inseparable from the damage. It was the same alpha particles that made the zinc sulfide glow that would, years later, shred the DNA inside their jawbone cells, rupture the membranes of the marrow, and turn the sturdy architecture of the skeleton into a fragile, perforated lattice. The light and the lesion were produced by the same source, at the same time, in the same bodies. The beauty was not a mask for the horror. It was the horror, seen from the outside, at a distance, before the vocabulary existed to name what was happening. A girl with glowing nails at a dance hall in 1920 was not a victim in a cautionary tale. She was a young woman enjoying a privilege, using a product, participating in an economy. The cautionary tale would come later, when the dentists began to notice the crumbling jawbones and the pathologists began to understand the physics of internal irradiation. But in that moment, on the dance floor, under the ultraviolet light, the only story was the story of now. The music, the lemonade, the boy who had asked her to dance, the way her painted smile floated ahead of her in the dark like a promise. The walk home ended. The boarding house door closed. In the morning, the girls would return to the factory, sit at the long wooden tables, and begin the familiar rhythm: lip, dip, paint. The brush would pass between their lips hundreds of times a shift. The radium would accumulate, microgram by microgram, in the mineral scaffolding of their bones. The company would continue to sell its luminous dials. The world would continue to revolve, and the glow would remain, a silent signal that meant both nothing and everything, a small, steady light that the girls had put there themselves, not knowing that it would outlast their own names, their own tombstones, the very memory of the evening when a young woman opened her mouth in a dark room and smiled, and the dark smiled back, politely, without revealing what it knew. There is a particular kind of silence that occupies a dental surgery after the last patient has gone. It is not the clean stillness of a library or the hollow quiet of a church. It is a silence dense with the memory of instruments, the faint metallic scent of sterilized steel, the ghost of clove oil, the leather of the chair cracked from years of bearing the weight of clenched anxiety. In 1922, in a small practice room in Orange, New Jersey, that silence was broken only by the slow, deliberate rhythm of a tooth extractor working against resistance. The young woman in the chair was named Molly Maggia. She was 24 years old, though the way she held herself made her seem decades older. She had once been a dial painter, one of the girls who sat at long wooden benches with fine camel hair brushes, shaping tiny numerals onto watch faces with a precision that earned good wages and quiet pride. Now she leaned back with her mouth open, her fingers gripping the armrests, her knuckles white. The dentist, Dr. Theodore Bloom, had seen difficult extractions before. He had treated factory workers, immigrants, the poor, but this was different. The gum tissue around her lower molars was ulcerated and receding, exposing bone that was not the healthy ivory of a living jaw, but something else entirely, discolored, porous, yielding. Blum adjusted the extractor, positioning the beaks around the tooth. He applied pressure. The sound that followed was not the clean pop of a healthy extraction. It was a low, wet crack, and with it, a fragment of bone the color of old parchment came away with the tooth. The bone crumbled between the steel tips, falling into the metal basin with a soft clatter. Blum paused. He looked at the debris, then back into the woman's mouth, and he understood that he was not looking at a simple dental infection. He was looking at something his training had not prepared him for. Molly Maggia had worked at the United States Radium Corporation from 1917 until 1920, shaping luminous paint with the same lip-pointing technique every girl on the floor used. She had been good at the work. Her dials passed inspection. She earned her pay and spent it on the small freedoms that money could buy for a working-class daughter: new stockings, an evening at the dance hall, the chance to walk home at dusk with traces of radium dust still shimmering on her collar and in the strands of her hair. But by the time she sat in Bloom's chair, she could no longer walk without assistance. Her weight had dropped precipitously. Her gums bled continuously. Her teeth loosened one by one, and each extraction brought with it more of that crumbling, dead bone. The dentist assigned a name to the condition: phosphorus necrosis. It was a known disease, well documented among workers in match factories, where white phosphorus vapor seeped into the bones of the jaw through cavities and cracked teeth, causing a slow, putrefying death of the bone. The clinical picture matched: the ulceration, the necrosis, the peculiar luminescence of decay. Blum's diagnosis was reasonable, even careful, but it was wrong. Molly Maggia had never worked in a match factory. There was no phosphorus in the luminous paint she had placed between her lips 1,000 times a day. The true mechanism was something no medical textbook had yet described. The diagnosis of phosphorus necrosis was, in retrospect, a kind of premature closure, a medical filing error that bought the Radium Corporation additional months of plausible deniability, while the bodies of its former employees continued their slow, invisible disintegration. The strange part was not that the condition mimicked a known disease. Many poisons wear the mask of familiar symptoms. The strange part was that the mimicry was so perfect that it convinced a competent clinician. Phosphorus necrosis had a distinctive presentation. The bone turned brittle, honeycombed with small abscesses, and emitted a faint, noxious odor. Radium was doing the same thing, but for an entirely different chemical reason. The outcome was identical, but the origin was a different element entirely. A different row on the periodic table, a different set of industrial choices. The body could not tell the difference. The dentist could not tell the difference. And so the category phosphorus necrosis became a decoy, a screen behind which a new kind of industrial injury grew undetected. When Molly Maggia died in September 1922, her death certificate listed the cause as ulcerative stomatitis and anemia. The words were accurate as far as they went. Her mouth was a continuous open sore, and her blood lacked the iron and red cells needed to carry oxygen to her tissues. But those words were also a euphemism, a clinical shorthand that concealed more than it revealed. Beneath the ulceration was a bone structure that had been transformed into something resembling coral, a latticework of holes where radium had deposited itself, emitting alpha particles in a continuous, silent barrage against the living cells that tried and failed to repair the damage. Beneath the anemia was a bone marrow so irradiated that it had stopped producing blood cells entirely. The symptoms listed on the certificate were surface phenomena. The death certificate did not lie, but it did not point to the factory on Alden Street, or to the paint that still glowed faintly in the dark, or to the executives who knew enough to wear lead aprons while handling the substance the girls were told to lip point. An autopsy was performed. The pathologist who opened Molly Maggia's jawbone discovered something that would eventually become a signature of radium poisoning, though at the time it was simply a medical curiosity, an anomaly that had no name. The bone was so thoroughly hollowed out that a finger could penetrate its structure without resistance. The hard, mineralized tissue that anchors the teeth and frames the lower face had been replaced by a fragile shell riddled with cavities that contained not living marrow, but a necrotic, granular residue. When the pathologist probed the bone, it crumbled like dry plaster. One observer later noted that the bone looked as though insects had been tunneling through it for years. There were no insects. There was only the quiet, methodical work of alpha particles, a form of radiation that could not penetrate the dead outer layer of skin but, once lodged inside the body, could shred the delicate architecture of living bone from a distance of only a few cells' width. The term radium jaw had not yet been coined. It would not enter the medical lexicon until 1924, when another dentist, Joseph Neff, and a pathologist named Harrison Martland began to connect the dots between the factory, the glowing paint, and the strange cluster of jaw necroses appearing in young women across northern New Jersey. But in 1922, Molly Maggia was a single case, a tragedy that seemed to belong to the unfortunate margins of industrial life rather than to any systematic danger. Her death was noted and then set aside because the machinery of industrial medicine was not yet equipped to recognize a disease that had no precedent. Phosphorus necrosis was the closest fit, so phosphorus necrosis it remained. The misdiagnosis was not willful ignorance. Bloom was a careful and ethical clinician, but it was a structural error, a failure of the diagnostic categories themselves to accommodate a new kind of harm. The categories were too rigid, too reliant on past patterns, and the new poisons slipped through the gap. The paradox is this: the very fact that radium-induced bone decay looked exactly like phosphorus poisoning allowed the true danger to remain hidden for years. The mimicry was so faithful that it created a false sense of understanding. Doctors believed they knew what they were dealing with. Company medical consultants, when they eventually examined other sick women, could point to the phosphorus necrosis diagnosis and argue that the disease was an unfortunate but known risk of factory work, unrelated to the luminous paint. The familiarity of the symptom became a shield for the novelty of the cause. Every girl who developed a crumbling jaw became another instance of an old story, not a chapter in a new one. In the dimness of that dental surgery, as Blum dropped the fragment of parchment-colored bone into a specimen tray, the air held more than the scent of disinfectant. It held the weight of a diagnostic error that would ripple outward for years. The sound of the extractor had been a single note in a longer composition, a composition that had begun with the discovery of radium by Marie and Pierre Curie in 1898, that had moved through the marketing of radium as a health tonic, that had settled into the bright factory floors where teenage girls shaped watch dials with the tips of their brushes and the moisture of their mouths. That composition was still playing, and its next movements would involve courtrooms, suppressed company reports, and the slow, painstaking exhumation of evidence from living and dead bodies alike. But in the surgery, all of that was still latent, hidden in the bone fragment like radium itself, waiting to be recognized. The human jaw is a remarkable structure. It is the only bone in the body that moves consciously, hinged at the temporomandibular joint, powered by the masseter muscle, capable of exerting hundreds of pounds of force per square inch. It houses the roots of the teeth in sockets called alveoli, and its dense cortical plate resists fracture, infection, and the daily wear of a lifetime of chewing. In the dial painters, that density became a trap. Radium, chemically similar to calcium, was absorbed into the bloodstream from the intestines and promptly laid down in the bone matrix wherever new bone was being formed. The jaw, constantly remodeling under the stresses of mastication, was a site of high cellular turnover, and so it became a depot. Once locked into the mineral lattice, Radium-226 began its slow work. Its half-life of 1,600 years meant that the radiation would continue long after the girl who carried it had become a name on a death certificate, long after the factory had changed ownership, long after the town of Orange had forgotten what was made there. The alpha particles emitted by Radium-226 are heavy and slow-moving. They travel only a few micrometers in tissue, barely the width of a single cell. Outside the body, they cannot penetrate the dead layer of the epidermis, but inside the bone, they are devastating. Each decay event releases a burst of energy that rips electrons from molecules, shattering the delicate machinery of DNA, rupturing cell membranes, and creating a microscopic zone of complete destruction. The bone cells called osteocytes, entombed in their small lacunae, are especially vulnerable. They cannot flee. They cannot repair the damage faster than it accumulates. They die slowly, and as they die, the bone matrix around them loses its living maintenance crew. The structure weakens. Cracks propagate. Bacteria from the mouth, finding a breach in the gums, invade the necrotic tissue. The result is a cascade: infection, inflammation, further bone death, and finally the characteristic honeycombed appearance that Bloom saw when he extracted Molly Maggia's tooth. What Bloom did not know, could not know, because the science of internal dosimetry did not exist yet, was that the visible decay was only the surface of a deeper process. The same alpha radiation that destroyed the jaw was also irradiating the bone marrow throughout her skeleton, suppressing the production of red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. The anemia on her death certificate was not a separate condition. It was a direct consequence of the radium. Her fatigue, her pallor, her susceptibility to infection, all of it traced back to the same source, a source that did not announce itself with a smell or a taste or a warning label, but simply glowed faintly in the dark, as if it were not a hazard at all, but a decoration. The pathologist who examined her remains saved a sample of the jawbone. It was placed in a small container and stored, as medical specimens often are, in a drawer or a cabinet, labeled with a case number and a tentative diagnosis. That fragment, like the girl it came from, still carried its burden of radium. If a Geiger counter had been placed near it, even decades later, the needle would have jumped, clicking with the persistent energy of a radioactive half-life that dwarfs a human lifespan. The specimen would have glowed in total darkness, though no one at the time thought to check. The light was the evidence, but it required the right kind of eye to see it, the right kind of instrument to measure it, and the right kind of institutional will to connect it to the factory on Alden Street. Theodore Bloom recorded the case in his notes. He published a short paper describing the condition, attributing it to phosphorus. The medical community read the paper and filed it under occupational diseases of matchworkers. The Radium Corporation continued to produce luminous dials, and the girls on the floor continued to lip point their brushes, to paint their nails and teeth for evening dances, to walk home glowing along the dark sidewalks of Orange. The diagnosis of phosphorus necrosis provided a comfortable explanation for any rumor of illness that might surface. It was a containment strategy, though Blum himself had no part in it. His honest mistake became a corporate asset. That is how industrial diseases often work. They are recognized first by the wrong name, in the wrong context, and the correction required to set the record straight is not just medical but political, economic, and legal. The body keeps its own books, but the entries are written in a language that takes time to translate. Molly Maggia's jawbone was a ledger page, inscribed not with ink, but with the physical signature of alpha tracks, microscopic scars that told the story of a poison mistaken for a pigment. The moment Blum heard that wet crack and saw the bone crumble, a new chapter of the story had begun, not the chapter of the girls who glowed in the dark, but the chapter of the evidence they left behind. The jaw had begun to tell. The question was whether anyone was listening, and whether the institutions designed to protect the public would read the evidence before more names were added to the list. The dim surgery faded from memory. The extractor was cleaned and returned to its tray. The chair was wiped down for the next patient. But the fragment of bone and the long chain of reasoning it would eventually force into existence remained in the quiet of the specimen drawer. The radium continued its silent counting, particle by particle, a clock ticking toward a future in which the girls who wore the paint like starlight would become the plaintiffs in a courtroom drama that forced America to reckon with the gap between what industry knows and what it admits. And at the center of that reckoning was a single dental procedure in 1922, a misdiagnosis that was both perfectly reasonable and catastrophically wrong, a pivot point where the story could have changed direction but did not, because the evidence was not yet shaped into a weapon. One could imagine Blum, late in his career, revisiting his notes on Molly Maggia after the truth had come out. Perhaps he sat in the same surgery, the same leather chair worn smooth, holding a radiograph of a different patient, a woman with the same moth-eaten bone pattern, the same unexplained anemia. By then, the term radium jaw was in the journals. The Harvard investigation had been suppressed and then leaked. The lawsuit of the 5 women in 1927 had made national news. He might have wondered what would have been different if he had questioned the phosphorus diagnosis earlier, if he had sent a sample of the bone for chemical analysis, if he had visited the factory himself. But that is the luxury of retrospect. In the moment, the diagnostic framework did its work, and that work was to name the disease in a way that made sense of the available evidence. The failure was not his alone. It was a failure of the entire system of industrial oversight, which had no category for a poison that looked like another poison, for a glow that was both beautiful and deadly, for a job that paid well and killed slowly. The story of Molly Maggia is not just a story of one woman's suffering. It is a story about the structure of ignorance, how it is built, maintained, and eventually broken open by the accumulation of data that no longer fits the established categories. The jawbone was the first piece of data that did not fit. It took years for other pieces to join it, and by then the woman who had provided it was buried, her grave eventually becoming one of the sites where a Geiger counter would measure the persistent signal of radium-226. A signal that will outlast the cemetery, the town, and the memory of the industrial age that created it. The wet crack of that extraction still echoes, in a sense, through the annals of occupational medicine, a sound that meant, if you were listening carefully, that something new had been born in the mouths of factory girls, and the name of that new thing was still waiting to be spoken. The X-ray viewing box clicked on with the sound of a glass bell being swallowed by silence. In the darkened examining room, the only light was the cold blue-white rectangle of the illuminator, and against it, suspended like a specimen of deep-sea biology, hung the human mandible. It was not the bone of an elderly patient worn by decades of ordinary use. This bone had belonged to a woman barely out of her teens. And across its surface, scattered like seed pearls in black soil, were points of light, not the uniform glow of healthy tissue, but distinct, brilliant, star-like concentrations where the jaw had been remade into something that was no longer entirely human architecture. The radiologist's finger traced the constellation without touching the film. Here, near the angle of the jaw. Here, around the sockets where teeth had once sat. Here, deep in the marrow space where the body's blood factory should have been. The lights were not artifacts of the photographic process. They were radium, and they were still emitting. The strange part was not that the poison was visible. The strange part was that the body had reached for it like a needed nutrient, pulled it from the bloodstream, and woven it into the most permanent fabric it possessed. To understand how a luminous paint became an internal demolition crew, you have to look not at the factory floor, but at the periodic table. Radium sits in the same chemical column as calcium, the alkaline earth metals, group 2, 2 electrons in the outer shell, identical valence behavior. To a bone cell engaged in the constant blind labor of mineral deposition, the distinction between a calcium ion and a radium ion is effectively invisible. Both are doubly positive. Both fit the same crystalline slots in hydroxyapatite, the mineral lattice that gives bone its compressive strength. The cell's membrane channels, evolved over 500 million years to select for calcium, open just as willingly for radium. The blood delivers both, and the osteoblasts, busy as bricklayers in a construction site that never sleeps, grab whatever fits and mortar it into place. The process is not malevolence. It is chemistry without a conscience, molecular hospitality extended to a guest that will never leave. Once incorporated, radium-226 settles into the bone mineral like a tenant who pays no rent but slowly dismantles the building from the inside. Its half-life is 1,600 years, which, measured against the span of a human life, is functionally eternity. The atom will decay, eventually, into radon gas, and then through a cascade of daughter products. But for the young woman who ingested it with every lick of her brush, the relevant timeline was measured in months and years. The radium nucleus, unstable from its creation in whatever ancient stellar explosion seeded it into the Earth's crust, eventually relieves its nuclear tension by ejecting an alpha particle. 2 protons and 2 neutrons bound together. A tiny cannonball fired at roughly 5% of the speed of light. The energy of that ejection is enormous on the atomic scale, about 4.8 million electron volts. To give that number a shape, it is enough energy to break tens of thousands of chemical bonds in the immediate vicinity, to snap the sugar phosphate backbone of DNA like a dry twig, to tear open cell membranes, to ionize water molecules into reactive radicals that then go on to attack other cellular structures. And all of this violence occurs within a range of only a few cells' width. The alpha particle, massive and charged, plows through tissue for perhaps 40 or 50 microns before it expends its energy and stops. In the open air, it can't even penetrate a sheet of paper. But inside the bone, where living marrow cells press directly against the mineral matrix, that short range becomes a design for focused devastation. The source and the target are neighbors in a tenement of mutual destruction. The body's skeleton is not a dead scaffold. It is a living organ, as dynamic as the liver or the lungs, continually remodeling itself through a dance of demolition and reconstruction. Bone-dissolving cells, the osteoclasts, etch away microscopically thin layers of old mineral. bone-building cells follow, laying down fresh matrix. This remodeling is what allows a skeleton to adapt to stress, to repair microfractures, to regulate calcium levels in the blood. But when radium is locked into the mineral, every act of bone turnover releases stored radioactivity back into the local microenvironment. A cell that happens to be dividing nearby, and bone marrow is a factory of division, churning out red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets at a furious pace, receives its dose at the worst possible moment, when its DNA is unspooled and vulnerable. The alpha particle crosses the nucleus in a straight line, leaving behind a trail of genetic wreckage. Some of that damage is repaired, imperfectly, some is not. The mutations accumulate. The marrow begins to fail. Anemia settles in like a slow tide, bringing pallor, breathlessness, and exhaustion so profound that even speaking becomes a labor of the body against itself. The blood counts drop. Infections find an open door. And within the bone itself, the constant low-grade inflammation of perpetual internal irradiation begins to whisper the possibility of a more catastrophic failure. The uncontrolled growth of bone cells, sarcomas that can erupt years after the exposure ended, as if the skeleton were finally announcing, in its own architectural language, that the contract it signed was never valid. The ledger was being kept, invisibly, all along, not in the company's safes, but in the hydroxyapatite crystals of the women's own frames. The poison had been mistaken for a building block by a chemical recognition system so ancient that it predates the existence of bone itself, an inheritance from the first single-celled organisms that learned to pull calcium from seawater and use it as a structural material. Radium exploited that billion-year-old trust. It wore calcium's uniform, spoke calcium's ionic language, passed through every checkpoint the body had evolved to screen out interlopers. And then, once it was sealed inside the vault of the skeleton, it began its work. There is a particular horror in this mechanism that is quieter than the horror of a visible wound, but deeper. The body was not invaded. It was deceived into cooperating with its own dismantlement. The women's very vitality, their youth, their active bone remodeling, their robust marrow production made them more vulnerable to the radium's effects, because the more the bone turned over, the more the stored radium was mobilized to irradiate new populations of dividing cells. The same biology that should have sustained them became the amplifier of the damage. A single microgram of radium-226 undergoes about 37,000 radioactive disintegrations per second. The dial painters who developed radium jaw and fatal anemias were later found, through direct measurement of exhumed bone, to be carrying total body burdens of between 10 and 20 micrograms, in some cases more. That means that inside their skeletons, every second, roughly 400,000 alpha particles were being fired into the surrounding marrow and bone tissue. 400,000 microscopic gunshots per second, each one capable of severing the molecular thread that held the cell's instructions together. As the seconds accumulated into minutes, minutes into months, the total dose delivered to the bone surfaces reached levels that, translated into modern radiation protection units, ran to hundreds or even thousands of sieverts, doses that would be considered catastrophic for a nuclear accident worker. But here were delivered not in a single acute flash, but as a continuous, grinding, unremitting exposure that the body could neither sense nor resist. There were no pain receptors for alpha tracks. No alarm system rang. The only evidence, in the early years, was a faint bluish glow if you turned off the lights and looked very closely at the right angle. And the girls had already learned to consider that glow a form of beauty. The pathology reports from the mid-1920s, when they finally started to arrive, read like architectural surveys of condemned buildings. Bone sections examined under the microscope showed a bizarre landscape. Normal trabeculi, the fine, interlacing struts of spongy bone, were replaced by a chaotic mixture of dying bone, reactive new bone of poor quality, fibrous scar tissue, and pockets of cellular debris. The marrow cavities that should have been filled with hematopoietic tissue, the soft red factory of life, were instead occupied by a grayish gelatinous substance, necrotic and acellular. The compact bone of the jaw cortex, which should have resisted a surgeon's chisel, crumbled under the slightest pressure, releasing a foul odor of devitalized tissue. Radiographs revealed not the clean white lines of healthy mineral, but a mottled, moth-eaten appearance, with radiolucent voids where the bone had simply dissolved and radiopaque patches where the body had attempted, vainly, to lay down repair material. In the most advanced cases, the mandible would spontaneously fracture under the normal pressure of chewing or during sleep, the patient waking to the sensation of a loose segment of her own jaw shifting inside her mouth. The clinical term eventually coined for this condition was radium necrosis of the jaw, but the term does not capture the slow, orderly process by which the body's own metabolic pathways had delivered the poison precisely to the site of its most intimate destruction. It was not an accident of external exposure. It was a systemic, biologically mediated, internally consistent catastrophe. What makes the Bone Seeker story particularly cruel in its scientific elegance is that the skeleton was, at the same time, the prison of the poison and the archive of the crime. The radium, once deposited, could not be chelated out by any means available to 1920s medicine, nor by most means available today, nearly a century later. The ion was locked into the crystal lattice with a binding energy that no gentle pharmacological intervention could overcome. Any attempt to strip radium from bone would simultaneously strip calcium, collapsing the mineral structure that kept the woman standing. The only medical strategy was to wait, to manage the infections, to debride the necrotic bones surgically, piece by piece, as the body slowly, over years, attempted to remodel the damage, a process that continually re-exposed the marrow to the radium that remained. It was a closed loop of injury. The body kept its own books, and the entries were written in alpha tracks. The discovery of this mechanism did not arrive as a single dramatic revelation. It was assembled piece by piece in the gap between two disciplines that rarely spoke to each other: industrial medicine and the new physics of radioactivity. Dentists saw inexplicable jaw necrosis in young women who had never worked with phosphorus. Pathologists examined bone specimens and found a pattern of damage that differed from the known occupational diseases. Physicists and chemists who understood the decay chain of radium-226 and its chemical affinity for calcium began to suspect the link. But the bridge between the radium on the dial painter's brush and the crumbling mandible in the surgical theater had to be built with evidence, with measurement, with the quiet, persistent work of scientists who were willing to look at what the company did not want seen. The X-ray itself became a tool of witness. Long before the phrase occupational dose entered the legal lexicon, a radiograph of a dial painter's jaw could show the star-like deposits of radium, each point a site of ongoing cellular bombardment, each cluster a map of future necrosis. The eerie beauty of those images, and they were beautiful, in the way that satellite photographs of dying coral reefs are beautiful, was the beauty of a process that had been hidden inside living bodies, now made visible by the very radiation that was causing the damage. The poison was, in a final twist, illuminating its own presence. The bone that should have been a silent, enduring scaffold had become a signal beacon, sending out a message in the form of photons and alpha tracks, a message that said simply, "Here and here and here. Listen." The skeleton outlasts the soft tissues. It outlasts the consciousness that animated it. In the cemeteries where the dial painters were buried, the radium continues its decay, 1,600 years stretching ahead before the first half of it is gone. The jawbones, the femurs, the vertebrae, the ribs, each one a small, slow-burning reactor, sealed in earth, still emitting. The energy that once made the girls luminous at evening parties is still there, reduced in intensity but not extinguished, a persistent physical fact that no legal settlement can cancel. The body's most enduring frame was reforged by a poison it mistook for a building block, and in that reforging, death was calcified into the architecture of life, not as a metaphor, as chemistry, as atomic physics, as the measurable, continuing, and entirely indifferent consequence of an industrial process that mistook the girls' bodies for a safe place to store a miracle. The archive does not erase. It waits in the dark with its own light. The electric lights on the third floor of the United States Radium Corporation's administration building had been switched off for the evening, but a single green-shaded desk lamp still burned in the office of the Vice President for Operations. Outside, the factory complex in Orange, New Jersey, had fallen quiet. No more hum of conveyor belts. No more clatter of glass vials being filled. No more rhythmic tap of camel hair brushes on watch faces. The night watchman had already done his first round, his footsteps fading down the linoleum corridor. In the silence, the only sound was the low metallic click of a lead-lined safe swinging shut, the bolts settling into their grooves with the finality of a coffin lid, followed by the dry whisper of a typewriter ribbon reversing its spool in the adjacent room, a clerk working late to file the correspondence that would never be mailed. That safe contained a single document that had arrived 3 days earlier from Cambridge, Massachusetts, bound in a plain manila folder and addressed, by hand, to the company president. It was a confidential report commissioned from the Harvard School of Public Health, and its author, a physiologist named Cecil Drinker, had spent weeks walking the factory floor, collecting air samples, interviewing foremen, and examining the young women who sat at long tables painting luminous dials. Drinker was not a crusader. He was a sober, methodical scientist who had been asked a specific question: are the working conditions at the radium plant injurious to health? His answer, typed cleanly on 23 pages, was unambiguous. The rooms were filled with radioactive dust that settled on workbenches, clothing, skin, and hair. The practice of lip pointing, putting the brush tip between the lips to shape it, introduced a measurable quantity of radium directly into the mouth with every single stroke. The ventilation was insufficient, the cleaning procedures non-existent, and the cumulative dose absorbed by the women was, in his estimation, lethal. He recommended immediate and sweeping changes: the abolition of lip pointing, the installation of fume hoods, the provision of protective clothing, and a program of regular medical monitoring for every worker on the dial painting line. The report cost the company several $1,000s. It was, by any measure, a bargain, because it contained the knowledge that might have saved several hundred lives. Instead, the executive who had commissioned it read, Drinker's conclusions in the privacy of his oak-paneled office, closed the folder, walked to the safe, and placed it inside. Beside it lay a stack of memoranda, internal correspondence from the company's own chemists, the men who purified the radium salts, who prepared the luminous paint, who had long ago recognized that the substance they were handling was not benign. Those chemists worked in a separate laboratory, a room that the dial painters were never permitted to enter. There, the men wore heavy lead rubber aprons that hung from their shoulders to their ankles, thick gauntlets, and sometimes even face shields when they transferred open dishes of radium concentrate. They used long-handled tongs to move containers, keeping the material at arm's length. They monitored their own exposure with primitive electroscopes, and when they noticed that a benchtop had accumulated a persistent glow, they scrubbed it down with solvents until the fluorescence disappeared. Every one of these precautions was a sentence in a language the company refused to translate. A lead apron is not a fashion choice. A pair of tongs is not a stylistic preference. Each piece of protective equipment was an admission, written in rubber and metal, that the substance being handled was dangerous enough to warrant a barrier between it and the living body. Yet when the dial painter's supervisor, a woman named Anna Rooney, once asked a visiting chemist why the girls were given no such protections, she was told, with a dismissive wave, that the paint was perfectly harmless, that radium was a health tonic, a revolutionary element that rejuvenated cells, that the girls were fortunate to work with it. The company had, after all, built its public reputation on the curative powers of radium. Its promotional literature, distributed to pharmacies and physicians, touted the benefits of radium-infused water, radium inhalators, and radium-laced cosmetics. The very watch dials the girls painted were marketed as a triumph of American science, bringing the miracle of perpetual luminescence to the wrists of soldiers, aviators, and gentlemen. In that context, the chemical reality on the factory floor, the dust that coated every surface, the paint that dried under fingernails and clung to hair, the faint metallic sweetness that some workers reported tasting at the back of the throat, could not be acknowledged without dismantling the entire financial architecture of the enterprise. So the knowledge was divided, and the division was policed with the quiet efficiency of a well-run filing system. One set of facts went into the safe. Another set of facts was handed to the women with their pay envelopes each Saturday afternoon. By the time Cecil Drinker's report was locked away in 1924, a handful of women had already begun to notice symptoms they could not name: a dull ache in the jaw that would not resolve, teeth that loosened inexplicably, then fell out, leaving sockets that refused to heal, a weariness so profound that climbing a flight of stairs required a rest at the landing. But the medical consultants retained by the United States Radium Corporation had a ready explanation, one that required no reference to radioactive isotopes or internal alpha bombardment. When the women sought help through the company's physician or were referred to specialists paid by the firm, the diagnoses they received were consistent and consistently damning: syphilis. Or, when that proved too difficult to reconcile with the women's personal histories, poor oral hygiene, a feminine tendency toward hysteria, or the vague and convenient catch-all of stomatitis, an inflammation of the mouth whose cause was left pointedly unspecified. The language of moral failure was deployed strategically, because a woman suffering from a venereal disease or a nervous disorder could be discredited more easily than a woman poisoned by her employer. The company's legal department understood a principle that would take decades for the wider world to learn. A sick worker with a ruined reputation cannot easily find an attorney. A plaintiff whose pain has been labeled as promiscuity or mental weakness will find the courtroom a hostile chamber before she even swears her oath. The smear was not improvised. It was coordinated through a network of consulting physicians, company claim adjusters, and legal counsel who shared a single objective: to delay, to deny, and to outlast. In the marginalia of internal memoranda that later surfaced during litigation, one finds candid acknowledgments of the true state of affairs. "The condition is undoubtedly due to the occupation," wrote one company doctor to a colleague in a letter that was carefully excluded from the workers' files. "We must be careful not to admit liability." Another memo from a chemist to a plant manager noted that the air in the dial painting room carried enough radium dust to fog a photographic plate left on a shelf overnight. The plate, developed the next morning, showed a ghostly image of the room's own furniture, a self-portrait of the space, drawn by radiation instead of light. That photograph was not shown to the women. It was filed in the same safe that held the drinker report, the memos about safety protocols, and the records of the chemist's own blood tests, which they conducted on themselves but never offered to the dial painters. The strange part was not merely that the company knew the danger and concealed it. The strange part was the double architecture of the knowing itself. On one side of the factory wall, a laboratory governed by the logic of the invisible: lead, distance, measurement, caution. On the other side, a workroom governed by the logic of the cosmetic: beauty, dexterity, fashion, trust. The same radium that chemists handled as if it were a small, furious sun was handled by the girls as if it were talcum powder. The contradiction was not hidden in a secret ledger buried in a filing cabinet. It was visible every day, in the simple act of a chemist walking through the dial painting room on his way to the shipping dock, his lead apron brushing against his knees, passing a row of women whose clothes were powdered with radium dust and whose supervisors were telling them with a smile that the glow on their fingernails made them look lovely. The report that Cecil Drinker wrote was never shown to state regulators. When a New Jersey Department of Labor inspector visited the plant in 1925, he was given a carefully sanitized tour that bypassed the areas where dust accumulated, and he was assured by management that all necessary precautions were in place. He filed a perfunctory report noting no significant hazards, and the matter rested there for 2 more years, during which time the bone sarcomas, the collapsed jaws, and the fatal anemias continued to develop in silence, at the tempo of alpha particles rather than headlines. The danger was not hidden in the radium. The danger was hidden in the filing system. A typewriter in an empty office is a peculiar instrument of history. It produces not only text, but carbon copies, thin, translucent sheets that carry the impression of the original keystrokes, layered between the top sheet and the backing paper. The company's internal correspondence, including the instructions to suppress Drinker's findings, was typed in triplicate: 1 copy for the recipient, 1 for the central file, and 1 for the locked safe. The carbon copies outlasted the executives who dictated them. They outlasted the company's reputation, and eventually, they outlasted the company itself. In the archives where these documents now rest, a researcher can still feel the faint raised impressions of the type bars on the onion skin paper, as if the machine were still speaking, very quietly, decades after the ribbon dried out. The paper holds the shape of the decision. And what of the workers in that moment, before the lawsuits, before the press coverage, before the term Radium Girls entered the public vocabulary? They knew their bodies were failing, but they did not yet know why. They visited dentists who extracted fragmenting bone and told them it was due to dietary deficiency. They consulted company doctors who asked intrusive questions about their private lives, then sent them home with bottles of tonic that did nothing. They lived in a fog of symptoms that had no name. And when they tried to name it themselves, when they started to whisper that maybe it was the paint, the dust, the stuff that made them glow, they were met with the smooth, practiced reassurances of men in suits who told them they were lucky to have such a clean, well-paid job. The patronizing tone was part of the machinery. It cost nothing to tell a working-class teenager that her fears were the product of an overactive imagination, and it bought the company another 6 months, another year, another quarterly earnings report with no liability accruals. The lead-lined safe in the vice president's office had a combination lock with 3 tumblers. The sequence was known to 4 men. On the night the drinker report was sealed inside, the last man to leave the office spun the dial and listened to the tumblers fall into place, a sequence of small, precise sounds, like the final punctuation on a sentence that would not be read aloud for a generation. In the factory below, the floors had been swept, but the sweepings had merely moved the radium dust from the tabletops to the corners, where it continued to emit its steady blue glow in the darkness, unanswered, unacknowledged, and, for the moment, unlitigable. The night compressed itself around the building. The typewriter ribbon ran out, and the story, like the element at its center, entered a period of latency, never gone, only accumulating, waiting for the moment when the sealed truth would decay into the open air. The sound arrived before the woman did. A hollow, rhythmic tapping on the courtroom's oak floor, the cadence of a cane held by a hand whose wrist had already begun to thin. It was January 1927, and the Essex County Courthouse in Newark was not prepared for what followed the sound. Grace Fryer led the procession, a bank clerk who had once painted watch dials in a sunlit room in orange, now walking as though each step required a negotiation between muscle and memory. Behind her came Quinta MacDonald, whose spine had begun to bow under the weight of lesions no one could yet name. Edna Hussman, who could no longer lift her arms above her shoulders. Catherine Schaub, who arrived on a stretcher and was carried into the courtroom like a plaintiff in a medieval petition, her body a document written in bone. And finally, Albina Magaya Larice, whose sister Molly had died 4 years earlier with a jaw that crumbled under a dentist's forceps, a death attributed to ulcerative stomatitis, to anemia, to anything except the factory where the paint had dried on her own lips. They were 5 women filing suit against the United States Radium Corporation, a firm whose ledgers recorded radium as a product and the women as piecework labor, not as biological experiments. The lawsuit alleged that the company had known the luminous paint was dangerous, had hidden that knowledge, and had permitted its workers to ingest a lethal substance with every pointed brush tip. The courtroom was not full. The press gallery, at first, contained only local reporters who expected a routine industrial complaint. But the atmosphere changed when the first witness leaned toward the microphone. Her words were slightly distorted, the consonants softened by a jawbone that was no longer structurally intact. A reporter in the third row paused his pen and looked up from his notepad, not because he could not hear, but because he had never heard human speech emerge from a mouth so obviously robbed of its architecture. The legal machinery that greeted them was not designed for bodies like theirs. New Jersey's statute of limitations for personal injury stood at 2 years. The clock, by statute, began ticking from the date of the injurious act. The dial painters had stopped their work years earlier. Grace Fryer had left the factory in 1920, 7 years before she filed her complaint. By the letter of the law, the door to the courtroom should have been barred long before her cane ever touched its threshold. The corporation's attorneys knew this. Their first motion was to dismiss. The delay between ingestion and agony, they argued, was legally irrelevant. The calendar was the calendar. But Raymond Barry, the women's attorney, a young, methodical man who had spent months poring over the factory's chemical manuals, offered the court a different clock. The injury, he argued, was not the moment radium entered the body. The injury was when the body began to fail because of it. Radium-226, he explained, did not announce itself. It lodged in the bone mineral and waited. It emitted alpha particles that could not penetrate a sheet of paper but could shred the marrow from within. The damage accumulated silently, a ledger of corrosion with no outward marker until the bone itself began to dissolve. The women had not known. They had been told the paint was harmless, that the glow was a novelty, that the exhaustion and the toothaches were the ordinary ailments of young women working long hours. The clock of injustice, Barry insisted, should start from the moment they learned the truth, not from the moment the poison first trickled past their gums. The judge, John Roebling, listened. The motion to dismiss was denied. A precedent that had never existed before cracked open, just wide enough for 5 dying women to step inside. The strange part was not that the legal argument succeeded. The strange part was that the law, which normally required documentary proof, contracts, correspondence, signed admissions, found its most persuasive evidence in the absence of matter. The women's bodies had become negative witnesses. Where a healthy jawbone should have shown solid cortical bone on an X-ray, the radiographs presented to the court revealed a honeycomb of voids, a skeletal lacework eaten away by radium's invisible persistence. One medical exhibit passed among the jurors on a tray was a dental film of Grace Fryer's lower mandible. The bone did not appear as a continuous structure. It appeared as a constellation of faint islands in a dark sea, islands that were shrinking. The jury did not need a chemist to explain the mechanism. They could see the subtraction. The company, meanwhile, had prepared a narrative that required no X-rays. Their medical consultants, prominent physicians retained to examine the plaintiffs, had issued reports attributing their conditions to syphilis, poor oral hygiene, or the generalized hysteria that early 20th century medicine found beneath every female complaint. It was a diagnosis that served 2 purposes. It explained the bone decay without implicating the factory, and it cast the women as morally suspect, their bodies already contaminated before they ever entered the company's employment. The press, at first, carried whispers of this counter-narrative. A newspaper item suggested that the dial painters were of loose character, their ailments a private matter dragged shamefully into a public court. The smear was not an accident. It was a deliberate architecture of doubt, constructed atop the same ledger book logic that had suppressed the company's own internal safety reports years before. But the architecture cracked under the weight of one fact that could not be spun into a moral failing. The women were dying in plain view. Catherine Schaub's stretcher could not be hidden behind a legal brief. Quinta MacDonald's twisted spine could not be dismissed as hysteria, not when she described the specific sensation of her vertebrae compressing under the weight of her own torso. Albina Maggiolarice testified about her sister Molly's final months, the gums that receded until the teeth simply lifted from their sockets, the sepsis that took her before her 24th birthday. The words were not loud. They were spoken in the dry, restrained language of a deposition. But the images they conjured were no longer sequestered in a factory infirmary. They were entered into the public record, a docket item with no statute of limitations attached. That shift from private symptom to public proof, accelerated when national correspondence arrived. Walter Lippmann, the era's most influential political essayist, wrote about the case not as a labor dispute, but as a moral fracture in the industrial contract. His columns did not plead for sympathy. They simply described the mechanism. A corporation had employed young girls, had exposed them to a known poison, had hidden the evidence, and was now watching them die from the council table. The story carried because it was not merely tragic, it was systemic. The dial painters were not isolated victims of a single bad factory foreman. They were the logical outcome of a supply chain that treated radium as a miracle and the workers as incidental conduits for its application. The glow on their dresses, the fashionable flecks on their teeth, the luminous dust that clung to their hair. Each particle had been an invoice, and the bill was being paid now in the public square. What the company had tried to hide from view became the only evidence vivid enough to overcome the legal machinery of delay and denial. The women's decay was not a private humiliation. It was the visible geometry of radium's half-life mapped onto human tissue. Each bone lesion, each missing jaw fragment, each hollowed vertebra was a data point that connected the factory floor to the courtroom floor with the ruthless elegance of a physical law. The law of Delaware, the law of New Jersey, the law of corporate indemnity, none of these could repeal the disintegration of calcium under alpha particle bombardment. The women's bodies had become instruments, measuring devices that registered the dose long after the dosimeters had been locked away in the chemist's lead-lined cabinets. The trial did not end in a clear verdict. The company's lawyers, recognizing the danger of a jury ruling that might set a precedent, began to pivot towards settlement discussions even as the testimony continued. They knew that time, in this case, was both a legal weapon and a biological executioner. The women's physical condition, already advanced, could not sustain a protracted appeals process. The corporation's strategy shifted from denial to delay, stall until the plaintiffs were too weak, too bedridden, too dead to press their claims. It was a ledger entry with a different column heading, but the arithmetic was the same. Yet the courtroom had already performed its deeper function. It had taken a medical phenomenon that was invisible, a radioactive isotope moving silently through the bone matrix, and made it legible to the law, to the press, to the thousands of readers who followed the case in the newspapers. The testimony of a woman unable to lift her head became a new kind of evidence, not merely of injury but of causation. The chain of inference, from dial to lip to bone, was no longer a theory advanced by a handful of skeptical dentists and pathologists. It was a matter of public record, ratified by the sworn statements of the dying. The corporation's sealed report from 1924, the one that had acknowledged the lethal conditions and recommended immediate ventilation measures, did not need to be introduced into evidence at that moment. It would surface later, a time capsule of admitted guilt. What mattered in that hushed courtroom in 1927 was that the silence had been broken. One by one, the women spoke into the microphone. Their words, slightly distorted by missing bone, were transcribed into the legal archive. The sharp scratch of a journalist's pen filled the pauses, converting testimony into type into circulation, circulation into a public memory that even a corporate settlement could not expunge. The mechanism of law, slow and procedural, had been forced to make room for a mechanism of nature, also slow, also procedural, but far less interested in human deadlines. The court of decay was now in session, and its record would outlast the company, the settlement, and the names on the tombstones. The strange part was not that justice moved. The strange part was that the evidence required to move it had to be extracted from the bodies of the victims, one vertebra at a time. The corporation's own safety protocols, the lead aprons, the long tongs, the confidential memos, had been a silent admission that the hazard was real. But the law could not read those silences. It could only read what had been spoken aloud, and what the women spoke aloud was the sound of their own skeletons giving testimony. The cane tapped, the pen scritched, and the public began to understand that the glow they had admired on the dance floor was, in truth, a persistent biological alarm that no company could shut off. The laboratory in Harrison Martland's Orange Memorial Hospital did not welcome visitors after sundown. There was nothing overtly secretive about it, just a customary locking of the door, a pulling of the blackout curtain, a quiet understanding among the night staff that the pathologist preferred to work without interruption. What he needed was total darkness. Not the near darkness of a dimmed surgical theater or the amber glow of a safe light in a photography studio, but an absolute abolition of light, the kind of black that renders the distinction between open eyes and closed eyes meaningless. In that blackness, he was learning to see something that had never been seen in a living human body. The apparatus was ungainly but simple. A fluoroscope, essentially a fluorescent screen mounted on a hinged arm, connected to a high-voltage X-ray tube. When the tube was energized and directed at a subject, the screen glowed faintly, translating invisible radiation into a visible shadowgram. But Martland was not interested in the shadows. He was interested in what happened when he cut the X-ray current entirely, when the only source of illumination in the room was the body itself. A dial painter would sit or stand before the screen, her blouse collar opened to expose the jaw, the neck, the upper thorax. The X-ray tube would be switched off. The darkness would settle like a held breath. And then, on the fluoroscope's coated surface, a constellation of pale blue-green pinpoints would begin to emerge, each one a microscopic deposit of radium embedded in living bone, silently broadcasting its location from deep within the cranium, the mandible, the vertebrae. It was as though the skeleton had swallowed a handful of stars and could not keep them down. Harrison Stanford Martland was not a radiologist by training. He was a pathologist with the temperament of a municipal detective, a man who had spent years cutting into the dead to extract testimony for the living. Born in 1883, educated at Columbia and the College of Physicians and Surgeons, he had returned to his native Newark to build a practice in an industrial city, dense with factories, foundries, and chemical plants, an environment where occupational disease was as common as it was poorly cataloged. He was the kind of physician who kept his own meticulous notebooks, who photographed every organ he removed, who believed that a laboratory could function as a court of evidentiary medicine if only someone would assemble the case. When the first dial painters began dying in the early 1920s, their deaths were attributed to a grab bag of conditions: phosphorus necrosis, syphilis, Vincent's angina, diphtheria, anemia. Martland suspected that the grab bag was a cover for something singular and new. The scientific problem was exquisitely difficult. You cannot see an alpha particle. You cannot touch, taste, or smell radium in a quantity measured in millionths of a gram. The damage it inflicts on the body is not immediate and not localized at the site of entry. It migrates, chemically impersonating calcium, and then irradiates the osseous tissue from within its own crystalline structure over months and years. By the time a patient presented with a crumbling jaw or a spontaneous fracture of the femur, the cause had been working in silence for so long that no ordinary autopsy could trace it backward. What Martland needed was a detection method that bypassed the body's opaque surface, a way to read the poison's own signature without waiting for the grave. The fluoroscope gave him that method, but not in the way its inventors intended. Wilhelm Röntgen's original X-ray images captured density contrasts, bones blocking radiation, soft tissue allowing it through. Radium, however, did not block radiation. It emitted it. When Martland turned off his X-ray source and let the patient's internal radium act as its own illuminator, he was exploiting a perverse property of the element that had, until that moment, been considered a scientific curiosity rather than a diagnostic tool. Radium's most celebrated feature, its self-luminosity, became the very mechanism of its detection. The women had once painted radium onto their teeth and fingernails in order to glow at dance halls, a fleeting fashion statement that rinsed off with soap and water. Now the same substance had migrated deep into their skeletons, where no soap could reach, and the glow it produced was no longer a party trick, but a clinical datum. The strange part was not that the glow existed. Physicists had known about radium's luminescent properties for decades. The strange part was that nobody had thought to look for it inside a living patient before Martland darkened his laboratory. The strangest part was what the glow implied once you understood its source. Every point of light on that fluoroscope screen marked a site where an alpha particle had recently collided with a cell, tearing through its nucleus, fracturing the delicate spiral of its DNA, initiating a cascade of errors that the body's repair mechanisms could not always correct. The image was not a static map, but a real-time readout of ongoing cellular destruction, broadcast in the only medium the radium knew how to use. The victim's body had become the instrument of its own indictment. Martland's 1925 paper, delivered before the New York Pathological Society, and published with the modest title, "Some Unrecognized Dangers in the Use and Handling of Radioactive Substances," did what no corporate memo or workers' complaint had been able to accomplish. It established an unbroken chain of causation between the luminous paint and the fatal bone conditions, and it did so in language that no court could dismiss as feminine hysteria. The paper described the clinical course of the disease in granular detail: the intractable anemia, the necrotic jaw lesions, the spontaneous fractures that occurred when a patient simply turned over in bed, and it correlated every finding with the presence of radium in the affected tissues. More importantly, Martland introduced a quantitative dimension. He had exhumed the bodies of several deceased dial painters, extracted samples of their bones, and measured the residual radioactivity using an electroscope. The numbers were tiny. The average victim carried between 10 and 20 micrograms of radium, an amount that would fit on the head of a pin and still leave room for a thimbleful of nothing. But those 10 to 20 micrograms were decaying continuously, emitting 4 alpha particles per radium nucleus per decay chain, and each alpha particle carried enough kinetic energy to kill any cell within a 40 micrometer radius. Multiply that by the 33 billion radium atoms in a single microgram. Multiply again by the years the radium had been lodged in the skeleton, and the equation resolved into a dose of radiation that, by modern estimates, exceeded several hundred rem per year, delivered continuously, without interruption, to the most sensitive tissues in the body. He calculated that a dial painter who had worked for 3 or 4 years had received a cumulative skeletal dose that would be considered lethal if administered externally over a matter of weeks. Yet the internal irradiation had stretched the process into a protracted, agonizing semi-decade. The poison did not kill quickly. It let the victim walk, work, dance, and marry, while it methodically reorganized the architecture of her skeleton into a latticework of microfractures and sarcomas. The bill had been accruing interest long before the first symptom appeared, and by the time the jaw began to tell its story, the debt had passed the point of collection. The exhumations were conducted in the early morning, before the cemeteries opened to the public, with a discretion that bordered on the sepulchral. Martland and his assistants would drive to a burial plot in Newark or Bloomfield or Orange, carrying shovels, canvas sheets, and lead-lined containers. They worked quickly, lifting the coffin, transferring the remains with a gravity that was both clinical and reverential. The bones they retrieved were often so honeycombed with necrotic cavities that they fractured under their own weight. In the laboratory, each bone was photographed, measured, and then reduced to ash in a muffle furnace, the temperature climbing to 600 degrees Celsius, until all organic matter had been driven off, and only the mineral matrix remained. That mineral matrix, the calcium phosphate apatite that had once given the bone its structural integrity, now carried the embedded radium atoms locked inside its crystals, like a secret written into the very mortar of the body. The ash was placed inside a calibrated electroscope, an instrument that measured the rate at which a charged gold leaf discharged in the presence of ionizing radiation. The faster the leaf fell, the more radium was present. In some specimens, the leaf collapsed almost instantly, as if the ash itself were breathing out an invisible wind. The data from those measurements formed the foundation of internal radiation dosimetry, a field that had not existed before Martland's work. He was not merely describing a new industrial disease. He was inventing the quantitative language needed to speak about it. The microgram, the rem, the half-life. These would become the vocabulary of a century's worth of radiation protection standards, from uranium mines in the Colorado Plateau to nuclear weapons facilities in Hanford and Los Alamos. The dial painters, who had never set foot in a physics laboratory or read a scientific paper, became the unconsenting cohort whose bodies calibrated the safety protocols for an entire atomic age. When the Argonne National Laboratory began studying the long-term effects of plutonium deposition in the 1960s, they used the data from Martland's radium cases as their baseline model. The women were not merely patients in a medical case study. They were the human dosimeters against which the invisible hazards of the nuclear industry would be measured for generations. There is a peculiar quiet at the center of this chapter. It is not the quiet of a courtroom or a strike or a public scandal, because Martland was not a lawyer or a labor organizer or a journalist. He was a man working in a darkened room with a fluoroscope and a notebook, methodically documenting what happened when an element with a 1,600-year half-life took up residence in a human skeleton and refused to leave. His silence was the silence of the laboratory, of the exhumation, of the ash cooling in the furnace, of the gold leaf falling inside the electroscope, but it was a silence that shouted across decades. Every point of light on his fluoroscope screen was, in a legal sense, a premonition of what would soon arrive in the civil courts of New Jersey. Every microgram of radium he measured was a weight added to the scale of evidence that the corporation had labored so long to keep empty. The discovery did not end the story. It made the story portable. Martland's paper traveled to medical libraries, to public health offices, to the desks of attorneys and journalists. It entered the briefs that Raymond Barry would soon file on behalf of Grace Fryer and her 4 fellow plaintiffs. It appeared, in translated fragments, in European radiological journals, where physicians in watchmaking towns in Switzerland and France began to recognize the same constellation of symptoms in their own dial painters. The darkness of Martlin's laboratory, sealed by a blackout curtain against the street lamps of Newark, had become a lens that brought the whole hidden geography of industrial poisoning into focus. In the end, what the fluoroscope revealed was not just the physical location of radium in bone, but the moral location of knowledge in a system that had deliberately placed knowledge and risk on opposite sides of the factory floor. The executives had worn their lead aprons and used their long-handled tongs because they understood, in precise scientific terms, that radium was dangerous. The girls had worn radium on their lips and clothes and hair because they had been told it was harmless. Between those two understandings lay the darkness that Martlin entered, and out of that darkness he pulled a faint, flickering signal that would outlast the company, the settlement checks, the tombstones, and the half-life of the poison itself. On a winter night in 1925, after the last subject had been measured and the fluoroscope had been switched off, Martlin sat at his desk and wrote a single sentence in his notebook. The ink was black, the page was white, and the sentence did not contain the words radium, necrosis, litigation, or liability. It read, "The body is the only record that cannot be cross-examined." Then he closed the notebook and turned out the lamp, leaving the laboratory to the darkness that had taught him how to see. The flash gun erupted with a soft, percussive thump, and for one instant the hospital room became a negative of itself. White walls turned to glare. The iron bedstead cast a charcoal slash across the floor, and the hand that held the fountain pen froze in the light like an exhibit tagged for the archive. The photographer lowered his camera, the magnesium smoke drifting sideways in the early draft from the window. The woman in the bed did not flinch. By then, the small explosions of flash powder were the least violent interruptions her body had learned to absorb. Her name, for the purpose of this record, was Grace Fryer, though the document she had just signed belonged to five plaintiffs, 5 names pressed into the thin blue lines of a legal agreement that had taken years to extract from the United States Radium Corporation. The agreement, dated June the 4th, 1928, awarded each woman $10,000 and an annual pension of $600. In the currency of the time, it sounded substantial, a working-class wage multiplied several times over. In the currency of the body, it was already too late. Several of the women were bedridden on the day of the signature. Some could no longer lift a glass of water without assistance. One had to be carried into the courtroom on a stretcher during the preliminary hearings, her ruined spine refusing to hold her upright. The ink on the settlement was barely dry before the first among them died. The hospital room was still again. The fountain pen, a black waterman with a fine nib, rested on the bedside table next to a glass of water and a small enamel basin. The pen's barrel retained the warmth of her fingers for a few seconds longer, as if her body was reluctant to relinquish even that small signature of life. Outside, the city of Newark was beginning its morning, the streetcars ringing their bells along Market Street, the printers' vans unloading the early editions. Somewhere in those stacks of newsprint, her photograph would appear that evening. The gaunt hand, the sharp cheekbones, the jaw that had been rebuilt by surgical scaffolding, under a headline that framed the settlement as the end of something. The readers would sip their coffee, shake their heads at the tragedy, and turn the page. But endings are rarely what they appear in the archive. To understand what that signature meant, what it cost, and what it could never repay, one must step back from the bedside and into the machinery of delay that the corporation had engineered with the patience of a chemist tending a slow crystallization. In 1927, When Fryer and 4 other former dial painters filed suit, the company already possessed the confidential drinker report, locked in a lead-lined safe in the office of the vice president. That report, commissioned in 1924 and suppressed without hesitation, had documented lethal levels of radioactive contamination in the workroom air, on the desks, on the brushes, and inside the bodies of the women who used them. The company's own scientists wore lead aprons. The company's own chemists handled radium with long tongs behind protective shielding. The women wore cotton smocks and painted their lips with the glowing paint before going out to dance. The asymmetry was not merely an oversight. It was a policy of selective knowledge, defended with lawyers, medical consultants, and public relations men who knew exactly which words to deploy. Syphilis, poor oral hygiene, hysteria. The diagnoses were not medical, they were strategic. They smeared the women's reputations before the radium had finished eating their bones. The lawsuit, therefore, was never a straightforward claim for damages. It was a war of attrition waged against bodies that were disintegrating on a fixed schedule. Raymond Barry, the young attorney who took the case, understood this with a clarity that bordered on the unbearable. The statute of limitations for personal injury in New Jersey was 2 years. The radium, incorporated silently into bone mineral, took 5, 6, 7 years to produce a jaw that crumbled under the pressure of a dentist's forceps. The law, like the skeleton, had a clock inside it. Barry argued that the clock should start not from the moment of exposure, the instant the brush tip passed between a girl's lips and deposited a few micrograms of radium-226 into her mouth, but from the moment she learned what those micrograms were doing inside her. It was an elegant piece of legal reasoning, and it was the only bridge across which the women could drag their failing bodies into court. The company fought the bridge. They filed motions. They challenged jurisdiction. They delayed depositions. They knew, with the cold precision of actuarial calculation, that time was their best witness. After each delay, a woman was weaker. After each continuance, a plaintiff struggled to remember the precise shade of pain that had visited her 10 years earlier. The strategy was not a secret. It was simply a ledger with 2 columns, legal fees on one side, biological half-lives on the other. When national press coverage began to crystallize around the case, Walter Lippmann and others writing in the New York World and beyond, the courtroom became a stage, and the women's bodies became evidence that even the most sympathetic jury could not ignore. One of the plaintiffs, Quinta MacDonald, could no longer lift her arm to take the oath. Her humerus, riddled with radium deposits, had been fractured by a spontaneous internal degradation that required no external force. She stood in the witness box with her arm splinted to her side, her voice steady but thin, describing the moment she felt the bone give way while she was lifting a saucepan from the stove. The sound it made, she said, was not a crack. It was a wet, sucking separation, like a boot being pulled out of mud. The jury heard this. The press gallery transcribed it. The company's attorneys objected. The judge overruled. The archive inscribed the moment into its permanent collection. Yet the settlement, when it came, was not a victory. It was a transaction of exhaustion. $10,000 and an annual pension of $600. The United States Radium Corporation did not admit liability. No executive was indicted. No one went to prison. The company continued to operate, continued to contest individual cases through the 1930s, settling each one only when the plaintiff was too weak to continue the legal dance. The pattern was as predictable as the alpha particle emissions still emerging from the bone mineral of every woman who had ever pointed a brush between her lips. The corporation treated justice as a negotiable commodity, and the currency in which they traded was time. The women had less of it than the company did. The settlement was the receipt for that transaction, signed in a hospital bed under the flash of a newspaper camera. The strange, paradoxical thing about that receipt, and this is the quiet pivot on which the entire history turns, is that while it closed the legal case, it opened something far larger, something that no judge and no boardroom could contain. The public outrage that the case ignited did not dissipate with the signing ceremony. It pooled, like a slow accumulation of radionuclides in the body politic, until it reached a critical threshold. In 1929, just 1 year after the settlement, the first safety standards for radium handling were established, provisional and incomplete, but real. They mandated ventilation, prohibited lip pointing, and required monitoring of workrooms. The standards were born directly from the mangled bones that had been displayed in X-ray viewing boxes during the trial, the same star-like concentrations of radium that Harrison Martland had taught the world to read. The women's skeletons had become the source code for industrial hygiene, and the code was being compiled into regulation. Then, in 1934, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Standards was established, a permanent institutional home for the principles that the Radium Girls had extracted from the corporation's reluctance. The Bureau took as its founding mission the investigation and prevention of occupational diseases that had previously been treated as acceptable costs of industrial progress. The term radium jaw entered the medical lexicon, and with it came the understanding that a corporation's private safety protocols, the lead aprons, the tongs, the shielded rooms, were not proprietary secrets to be hoarded, but evidence of a duty of care that extended to every worker who handled the same materials. The law began to incorporate this asymmetry. Employers could no longer claim ignorance of a hazard that their own chemists had measured and quantified. The burden of proof began to tilt, fractionally, toward those who held the ledgers of risk. And yet, the most enduring legacy of the Radium Girls was not written in statutes or in union contracts. It was written in the silent arithmetic of internal radiation dosimetry, a language that the women themselves never spoke, but that their bodies had been forced to teach. In the 1960s, as the United States scaled up its nuclear weapons program, scientists at the Argonne National Laboratory faced a problem that had no easy experimental solution. Plutonium, like radium, is a bone-seeking alpha emitter. Workers handling plutonium in the weapons complex were inhaling microscopic particles that would lodge in their skeletons and deliver continuous, low-level radiation doses for the rest of their lives. Safe exposure limits could not be established through routine toxicology because the very nature of the hazard, the accumulation over time, the decades-long latency, the silent onset of bone sarcomas, required data that spanned a human lifetime. The scientists needed a cohort of individuals who had carried a known quantity of a bone-seeking radioisotope inside their bodies for years or decades, whose health outcomes had been meticulously documented, and whose remains could be measured with precision. That cohort existed. It was the Radium Girls. The women who had been given a pittance while dying, the women whose settlement checks arrived after their jaws had collapsed, the women whose names appeared in the margins of corporate legal files as liabilities to be managed. These same women, posthumously, became the calibration standard for an entire nuclear industry. Their body burdens, painstakingly reconstructed from exhumed bone samples and from the clinical records that Martland and his colleagues had compiled, were used to model the relationship between radium intake and cancer risk. Because radium-226 and plutonium-239 behave similarly in the human skeleton, both deposit on bone surfaces, both emit alpha particles, both remain until the bone itself is remodeled or until the host dies, the radium data could be translated into plutonium safety guidelines. Every permissible exposure limit for plutonium workers in the United States, every air monitoring protocol in a glove box facility, every medical surveillance program for nuclear fuel reprocessing workers, traces its lineage back to the bodies of the young women who painted watch dials in orange. New Jersey. This is not a metaphor. It is a metrological fact. The argon studies, published under titles like Radium in Humans, a review of U.S. studies, explicitly cite the dial painters. The tables and graphs that define the maximum allowable body burden for plutonium-239 rest on dose-response curves generated from the radium measurements. When a nuclear safety officer reads the bioassay results of a worker at Los Alamos or Savannah River, the numbers on the printout are compared against standards that were paid for in exquisite biological detail by the women whose court case was settled for $10,000 and an annual pension. The irony is almost too precise to be believed. The same corporation that fought to conceal the danger became the unwitting supplier of the data that would protect workers in an entirely new industry because the women's bodies had become, against every corporate effort to the contrary, the most thoroughly documented source of internal radiation toxicity in scientific history. The photograph taken in the hospital room that morning, the flash gun freezing the moment of the signature, now resides in the archival collections alongside the Drinker Report, the Martland papers, and the argon data files. The woman's hand, gaunt and still, holding the fountain pen, is the point of intersection between two irreconcilable narratives. In one narrative, she is a victim of industrial negligence, a plaintiff whose legal victory was hollowed out by the very mechanisms that were supposed to deliver justice. In the other narrative, she is an involuntary pioneer, a donor of data that would outlast the company, the courtroom, and the century. These two narratives do not cancel each other out. They coexist, like calcium and radium, sharing the same crystal lattice, one sustaining the architecture of life, the other dismantling it from within. Listen, if you will, to the quiet that followed the flash. The photographer packed his plates. The lawyer folded the document into a leather portfolio. The nurse adjusted the window shade, letting the early light fall in a long parallelogram across the linoleum floor. The woman in the bed, Grace Fryer, or perhaps one of the others who survived long enough to sign, did not speak. She had already said what she needed to say, in the courtroom, on the witness stand, and now the pen had spoken on her behalf. The ink was a compound of iron gall and gum arabic, stable, archival, designed to last for centuries. It would outlast the pen. It would outlast the hand that held it. It would outlast the hospital, which would be demolished decades later to make way for a parking structure. The half-life of legal ink, like the half-life of radium-226, is indifferent to human urgency. The document would yellow. The photograph would fade. But the signature would remain, legible through its own slow degradation, a treaty between the dead and the living that no one had been quite willing to sign until there was no more time left to negotiate. The strange part was not that the settlement was inadequate. That was predictable, almost banal in its cruelty. The strange part was that the settlement was not the end. It was a threshold across which the story continued in two directions at once, backward, into the court records, the suppressed memos, the flickering fluoroscope screens, and forward into the nuclear laboratories, the safety manuals, the dosimetry badges worn by workers who would never know the names of the women who calibrated their protection. The suffering was simultaneously discarded and immortalized. The living women were given a pittance while dying. The dead women were given a posthumous role in the architecture of atomic safety, a role that required no consent, no signature, no pension. They became an unseen cohort, their bones still speaking in the language of Geiger counters and confidence intervals, long after the last corporate file was archived and the last newspaper clipping was microfilmed. And if you could stand in that hospital room now, after the flash had died, after the photographer had gone, after the pen had been cleaned and returned to its case, you would hear only the sound of the city waking outside, the distant clang of the streetcar, the murmur of a radio in the next room. But beneath that, if you listened with instruments more sensitive than ears, you would detect a fainter signal. The slow, steady emission of alpha particles from the bone mineral of the woman in the bed, a radiation that would persist for 1,600 years before half of it decayed, and then another 1,600 years for half of the remainder, and on into a future that has no memory of watch factories or legal settlements or fountain pens. The half-life of radium does not know about the statute of limitations. It does not recognize the authority of a corporate board. It simply continues, emitting its silent testimony, a light that no one can see but that every subsequent generation of safety engineers must learn to read. The archive of injustice does not need a lock or a key. It is embedded in the very materials of the world, and it will outlast us all. The night arrives without ceremony, the way it always does over the old orange cemetery, a slow thickening of the air, a blue-gray wash across the headstones, the grass wet with the memory of a rain that fell 3 hours before. The clouds hang low enough that there are no stars, no moon, only a diffuse amber glow from the distant streetlights of a town that has all but forgotten what lies beneath its soil. A car door closes quietly, careful not to echo. 2 figures step out, one carrying a yellow-painted box with a thick rubber grip, the other a clipboard with pages that ruffled in the damp breeze. They do not speak much. They know why they are here. The instrument is a Geiger-Müller counter, calibrated for the soft beta and gamma whispers that pass through wood and earth and time. They walk along the gravel path, the sound of their footsteps dampened by moss that has crawled over the stones. Then one of them stops, lowers the wand, and flips the switch. The sound begins as a sporadic clicking, the kind of noise a cricket might make if a cricket were made of electricity. It is slow and irregular, a dry punctuation in the dark. But as the wand passes over a particular grave, an unassuming slab of limestone, the name Molly already half-eaten by a century of acid rain, the clicking quickens. It rises into a crackle, a steady sputter like fat hitting a hot pan, then into a rattle so dense that the individual ticks lose their separation and merge into a single sizzling hiss. The needle on the meter wedges itself into the red. The man with the clipboard writes a number, checks it against a previous reading from 1962, notes that it has diminished by less than 10%. He does not look surprised. Radium-226 has a half-life of 1,600 years. The skeleton beneath the grass has been emitting its signal for a little over a century. It will remain detectably radioactive for tens of millennia. The ink on the death certificate has long since faded, but the signature of the factory floor persists in a language that needs no light, no paper, no witness. This is the sound of an unfinished conversation. It is the metronome of a slow-motion event that started with a young woman dipping her brush into a pot of pale green paste, putting the tip between her lips and painting a delicate line onto the face of a watch. The radium entered her bloodstream, traveled through the vascular network, and was received by the bone mineral as if it were calcium, a familiar knock at the door, a chemical identity card that the body did not question. Osteoblasts laid it down into the collagen scaffold of her skeleton, where it would stay not for a working lifetime, but for geological time. Inside that bony vault, the radium continued its stately decay, firing alpha particles into the soft marrow that once manufactured her red blood cells, puncturing chromosomes, snipping the delicate tethers of deoxyribonucleic acid, initiating mutations that lay dormant until the moment they bloomed into sarcomas. All of this was invisible then, but the Geiger counter reveals that it is not invisible now. The glow the girls wore as a fleeting costume, brushed onto teeth, dabbed onto fingernails, smeared onto eyebrows to delight the dance halls, has been translated into a persistent biological echo, a telegram from the early 20th century that the 21st can still receive. The exhumations began in earnest in the 1950s, when the nascent nuclear weapons complex needed to understand what happened when a radioactive bone seeker lodged itself inside a human body. The men who built the atomic bomb worked with plutonium-239, another alpha emitter that follows calcium into the skeleton, and they knew that the dial painters represented a grim but irreplaceable dataset. So pathologists returned to the graveyards of New Jersey, Illinois, and Connecticut with augers and stainless steel trays, with legal permissions and a quiet unease. They lifted the coffins, some still surprisingly intact, and they removed samples, femurs, vertebrae, sections of calvarium. In the laboratory, the bones were ashed, dissolved in acid, placed in front of scintillation counters. The results were precise. The average victim carried between 10 and 20 micrograms of radium, a speck smaller than a grain of pollen, and from that speck came a continuous dose of ionizing radiation, hour after hour, year after year, a dose that never tired, never slept, never forgot. The data were fed into mathematical models that define the relationship between body burden and cancer risk, models that were then used to set the permissible exposure limits for plutonium workers at Hanford, at Los Alamos, at Rocky Flats. The dial painters became, without their consent and long after their deaths, the standard candle. One of the strangest facts recorded in the forensic literature is that the radium in certain bones migrates over decades. It concentrates into hot spots, small knots of intense radioactivity, because the alpha particle damage remodels the bone tissue, causing the body to resorb and redeposit mineral in a chaotic attempt at repair. The result, under a scanning electron microscope, is a surface that looks like an aerial photograph of shell craters. The hot spots appear on X-ray film as tiny starbursts, points of light that the doctors of the 1920s called radium rays, and that Harrison Martland captured on his primitive photographic plates. Today, those same starbursts can be imaged with autoradiography, the bone itself taking a picture of its own internal contamination. If you place a slab of a dial painter's femur against a sheet of fine-grained film and leave it in the dark for a week, the developed image shows a constellation of dark grains, a map of trauma drawn in silver halide. The picture is not merely a scientific record. It is an act of testimony, a statement made by the dead about the dead. and yet the cemetery remains quiet. The Geiger counter clicks, the wind moves through the grass, and the low clouds slide over the ridgeline without breaking open. The headstones in this section share a common vocabulary of loss. Dates that end in 1922, 1923, 1924, 1925, a short clustering that tells its own story. Many of the women were in their early 20s, some were younger. The limestone has softened, the marble has grown lichen, the granite still holds its polish, but the lead lettering has begun to lift from its grooves. In another few centuries, the names will be gone entirely, absorbed into the general anonymity of soil. But the radium will remain, pulsing its slow metronomic heartbeat through the strata, a signal that outlasts both the legal settlements and the corporation that fought them. It is a strange kind of monument, involuntary, invisible, yet utterly legible to anyone with the right instrument. The engineers at Argonne National Laboratory, who compiled the radium cases into a single database that filled several filing cabinets, referred to their study population not as victims, but as the former dial painters. The language was clinical, the graphs precise. On a logarithmic plot, the incidence of osteosarcoma rises almost linearly with the square root of skeletal dose. The certainty of that line is built on the uncertainty of individual suffering. A woman whose name appears as a 3-digit code, a femur measured in microRöntgen per hour. A death certificate cause, adjusted from oral infection to radiation-induced malignancy, by a retrospective pathologist who never met the person. The data set is both intimate and impersonal, the way a satellite photograph of a battlefield is intimate and impersonal. You can see the shape of the event, but you cannot hear the voice. But if you stand in the cemetery long enough for the Geiger counter to settle into its rhythm, long enough for the cold to seep through the soles of your shoes, you begin to sense a different kind of presence. It is not a ghost story. Ghost stories rely on the idea that the dead have something left to say, some message they are straining to deliver. The dial painters have already delivered their message. It is encoded in the isotope ratios, in the medical records, in the transcripts of the court cases that were settled for a few $1,000s while their spines crumbled. The message is simple. The girl who painted a luminous butterfly on her cheek for a Friday night dance was already wearing her grave clothes. The radium did not discriminate between the skeleton and the spectacle. It entered the body with the same indifferent precision whether the girl intended to glow for one evening or for 100 generations. That is the nature of an element. It has no politics, no memory, no moral arc. It simply has a half-life. The forensic scientists who work at these exhumations report an experience that is less emotional than technical, but nonetheless strange. They are accustomed to the ordinary decay of organic matter, the reduction of tissue to adipocere, the slow bleaching of bone. But when they lift a dial painter's remains, they are handling something that is not entirely biological. The radium makes the bones thermally slightly warmer than the surrounding soil by an almost immeasurable fraction of a degree. It gives them a faint, persistent luminosity when viewed through a fluoroscope in a completely dark room. It causes the air around the sample to ionize at a rate that a sensitive electrometer can read. The body is no longer merely a body. It has become a source, in the physical sense, emitting a form of energy that does not belong in a graveyard. It is the only grave that announces its occupation not with a stone, but with a signal. The public imagination has occasionally latched onto this signal. In the 1980s, A team of researchers placed a gamma-ray spectrometer near the grave of one of the most famous dial painters and recorded a spectral line at 186 kiloelectron volts, the unmistakable fingerprint of radium-226 decay. The measurement was published in a health physics journal, dry and unadorned. But the image that accompanied the article, a graph with a sharp peak rising from a background continuum, carried an unspoken weight. Here was a woman reduced to a spectral line, a single sharp note in the electromagnetic spectrum, and yet that note was still being sung, faintly but clearly, 70 years after her death. The article's authors did not mention the color of her hair, the sound of her laugh, the temperature of the factory room where she painted her first dial. They did not need to. The graph was not a eulogy, it was a fact. The wind rises, shakes a few drops of water from the leaves of a nearby oak, and the two figures with the Geiger counter begin their slow walk back to the car. They have recorded the numbers, filled out the forms, verified that the containment measures are still adequate, that no radon gas is migrating into the groundwater at a dangerous level, that no unauthorized exhumation has disturbed the soil. Their work is part of a long, quiet protocol that began when the lawsuits ended and the laboratories took over. The dial painters are now a permanent monitoring site, an ongoing environmental stewardship project. The company that poisoned them has been dissolved and its assets dispersed, but the scientific and legal systems that were built in response to their suffering continue to function quietly in the way that institutions do when the public attention has moved on. Every few years, someone visits with a detector. Every few decades, a paper is published that recalibrates the risk models. The cycle is as regular as the decay itself, half-life after half-life, report after report. It would be easy to end with a note of despair, to say that the signal is a condemnation, that the glowing soil is an open wound that will never heal. But that would misunderstand the nature of the half-life. Radioactive decay is not an injury, it is a clock. It measures time in the most democratic unit possible, the probability that a single nucleus will undergo spontaneous transformation. There is no memory in it, no anger, no sorrow. The radium in the ground is simply following the same physical law that governs the radium in a laboratory standard. The same law that governed the uranium from which it was originally mined. The same law that will govern it when it decays, eventually to stable lead, in a future so distant that the geography of New Jersey will have been remade by ice sheets or rising seas. The tragedy is not that the signal lasts. The tragedy is that the signal had to be. Back in 1917, when the dial painting studio was expanding, a young woman named Amelia Maggia, Molly, to her friends, would have walked home along this same stretch of road, her coat flecked with luminous dust, her hair smelling of the faint metallic tang of radium salts. She could see her own hands glowing ahead of her in the dark, and the hands of the other girls walking alongside, a small procession of light moving through the suburban streets. She did not know what was happening inside her bones. A few years later, her dentist would extract a tooth and the socket would not heal. A few months after that, the bone itself would begin to fragment. By 1922, she was dead. Her body was buried in this cemetery, and the radium inside her continued to glow, as it glows now, not as a warning, but as a property of matter. The night sky does not warn, the rock does not mourn, the Geiger counter does not judge. It only clicks, and the clicks rise and fall like a tide, and then the wind moves through the grass, and then there is stillness. Stillness, the low clouds breaking at last to reveal a patch of indigo sky, a single star, the silhouette of the oak tree, the headstones leaning at angles that speak of frost heave and gradual subsidence. The instrument is switched off, packed back into its foam-lined case. The car pulls away, its tail lights 2 red points diminishing along the cemetery road. And beneath the grass, in the dark, the Radium continues its long, precise, indifferent journey from one element to the next. A journey that has no final destination, only a half-life, and then another half-life, and then another. Each one shaving a little more energy from the nucleus. Each one a small, silent clock marking the difference between the time of human industry and the time of the Earth. The girls who glowed in the dark are not waiting to be remembered. They are simply still glowing. And that, in the end, is the heaviest fact of all. The truth that emerged from the dark water was this: the body keeps its own ledger. In the crumbling jaw of Molly Madia, in the star-like radium deposits on a fluoroscope screen, in the suppressed Harvard report locked inside a lead-lined safe, the evidence was always there. The girls who painted their teeth and walked home glowing were not victims of a mysterious plague. They were the archive. Their bones recorded what the company refused to say: that radium wears calcium's uniform, that the skeleton mistakes a poison for a building block, that a 1600-year half-life does not care about a 2-year statute of limitations. What became visible below was the double architecture of industrial knowledge. On one side of the factory wall, chemists in lead aprons handled radium with long tongs. On the other side, teenage girls in cotton smocks were told to point their brushes between their lips. The same substance that was a miracle in the catalog was a demolition crew inside the body. The gap between those 2 rooms was not an accident. It was a filing system. And the cost of that system was measured not in dollars, but in hollowed vertebrae, in jaws that crumbled under a dentist's forceps, in settlements signed from hospital beds. The broader implication is quiet but inescapable. The most dangerous distance is not between ignorance and knowledge, but between the knowledge held by those who protect the product and the knowledge given to those who touch it. The dial painters calibrated the safety standards for the nuclear age. Their bones became the measure for plutonium workers. Their suffering, the curve on a graph. They saved lives. They never met. But they should not have had to die to do it. Some substances are safest when they remain evidence, not experience. The descent was close enough. Now the pressure eases from the hull. The dark water begins to thin. Overhead, a gray light widens, and the hatch opens to cold sea air. The file on the Radium girls closes, but the evidence comes back with us, not to relive the damage, but to remember that the glow was never harmless. If this kind of quiet descent into science and history is what you came for, you can subscribe to The Deep Archive. The file closes, the glow remains,